Secret agent James Bond 007 is sent to Jamaica to investigate the murder of a fellow agent. Bond discovers a sinister plot led by the mysterious Dr. No, a reclusive scientist living on a remote island. And with the help of the beautiful Honey Ryder, Bond infiltrates Dr. No's secret lair, where he discovers a plan to sabotage U.S. rocket launches using a powerful radio beam. In a climactic showdown, Bond destroys the villain's atomic facility, escapes the island before it explodes, and sails away victorious with Honey Ryder, marking the beginning of the iconic Bond film legacy. James Bond was created by Ian Fleming, who was an English author, a journalist, and naval intelligence officer. Ian Fleming served in Britain's naval intelligence during World War II, and afterwards he retired to Jamaica and wrote his first novel, Casino Royale, in 1952. And in it, the main character was loosely autobiographical, a hard-drinking, hard-gambling, womanizing spy, also known as 007. And he envisioned his hero as looking like pianist Hoagy Carmichael with the mannerisms of actor David Niven. And originally, Ian Fleming considered naming his protagonist James Secretan. However, he wanted a very bland name that would contrast to this character's extravagant world-traveling adventures. So he chose the name of an author of a book on bird watching, the ornithology textbook titled Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. Casino Royale was released in 1953. It was an instant success and sold out in less than a month. Furthermore, critics universally praised the novel. The very next year, Ian Fleming sold the rights to Casino Royale to CBS for $1,000. So in 1954, CBS turned Casino Royale into a 1-hour black and white television episode for their series called Climax, and it starred American Barry Nelson as James Bond and a British Felix Leiter. Interestingly, it starred Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre.
This game fascinates me, but I just can't get the hang of it.
Well, it's like any game. You win or you lose.
Ian Fleming was not very happy of this production of his novel, and he vowed that the next time he saw James Bond on screen, he would have more control over the project, and it would be more worthy of his book franchise. Meanwhile, Ian Fleming was having success with his James Bond book series. The character was very popular, and he even starred in a series of comic strips based on the Ian Fleming novels, and these were also very popular. Interestingly, Dr. No started out as a screenplay before it started out as a novel. In 1956, producer Henry Morgenthau III wanted Ian Fleming to write a screenplay for a TV series titled Commander Jamaica, and the antagonist was a Chinese overlord based on Fu Manchu. However, those plans fell through. So in 1957, Fleming took the premise of Commander Jamaica and turned it into his 6th James Bond novel. The book was released in 1958, and it was the first Fleming novel to receive negative critical reviews in Britain, but did receive positive reviews in the US. In 1961, Ian Fleming met with Canadian movie producer Harry Saltzman about making a James Bond movie, and Fleming ended up selling the movie rights to the James Bond franchise for $50,000. Now this is worth $500,000 when adjusted for inflation, so you can say that Harry Saltzman still got a pretty good deal. However, he could not sell the rights to Casino Royale because it was already owned by CBS, and he couldn't sell the rights to Thunderball because it belonged to a man named Kevin McClory. But we'll talk about that in a second. Unfortunately, Harry Saltzman did not have the financing to produce a James Bond movie. He was then introduced to American producer Albert Cubby Broccoli, who was also trying to purchase the James Bond movie rights. In 1961, there was a lot of attention on the James Bond character after popular US President John F. Kennedy stated that James Bond was his favorite character and that the book From Russia with Love was his favorite novel. Cubby Broccoli tried to purchase the rights from Harry Saltzman, but Saltzman refused. So instead, they formed a partnership and created Eon Productions and began to develop their first James Bond movie. Now, it is well known that Eon stands for everything or nothing, and this is simply accepted. And Cubby Broccoli's own daughter and current co-head of Eon verified this in a documentary. However, Cubby Broccoli's stepson and current head of Eon, Michael G. Wilson, has publicly said that he has never heard that Eon stands for everything or nothing. And it appears the idea for Eon being an acronym for everything or nothing began in 1983 with a James Bond book by J. Rubin. Others, including Michael G. Wilson, have claimed that Eon is a play on Eon, meaning an immeasurable period of time, and was Saltzman and Broccoli's hope that Eon would be around for ages, still making James Bond movies in the future. So, like our international spy himself, the meaning of Eon remains a mystery. Broccoli originally wanted to make Thunderball and was disappointed to learn that Kevin McClory held the movie rights. In 1958, about 4 years before Ian Fleming met Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli, he had a meeting with Kevin McClory, as well as 2 other Hollywood producers, and he invited them to his home in Goldeneye. They brainstormed and wrote a screenplay which would eventually become Thunderball. And it was here that they invented the bad guys, which was an organization named Spectre. Well, the idea of the screenplay fell through, the partnership dissolved, and everyone went their separate ways. And about 3 years later, in 1961, Ian Fleming published Thunderball and did not mention Kevin McClory. And Thunderball ended up becoming Ian Fleming's 9th James Bond book. Kevin McClory sued Ian Fleming and won. And they eventually settled out of court where Ian Fleming paid Kevin McClory $100,000, and Kevin McClory ended up winning future rights to any movie versions of Thunderball. But we'll talk more about that when we get to our movie Thunderball, as well as Never Say Never Again. Ultimately, Dr. No was chosen because it had a straightforward story and only one location of Jamaica, thus lowering production expenses. Cubby Broccoli was born in Queens, New York, and lived in Beverly Hills, and he was completely an American producer, but was committed to maintaining the British identity and the British feel of the James Bond franchise. In 1962, Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were able to successfully pitch the film to United Artists, and United Artists gave them the ultra-low budget of $1 million to make this movie. Now, to put this into perspective, the other hit from 1962 was Lawrence of Arabia, which was made for $15 million. So Dr. No was 15 times cheaper than the average Hollywood movie coming out at the time. For director, Eon asked Guy Hamilton, but Hamilton turned it down. Hamilton would later go on to direct Goldfinger, but ultimately they hired Terrence Young, who had directed some of Cubby Broccoli's other films. Terrence Young was known for being the suave, well-read, sophisticated playboy with a reputation for being a ladies' man. He was also known for dressing in these expensive suits that were tailored at Savile Row, and he was considered perfect to direct James Bond. For the role of James Bond, Broccoli and Saltzman wanted Cary Grant. However, Cary Grant was already a big star and could only commit to one picture. Their second choice was an actor named Richard Johnson, but at that time he couldn't be released from his MGM contract. Their third choice was an actor named Patrick McGoohan, who turned down the role unless Eon agreed to turn down the sexuality in the movie. Patrick McGoohan would later go on to play a secret agent in the TV show The Prisoner. The next actor they considered was a fairly unknown actor named Roger Moore, and they decided to turn him down because they thought he looked too young and too pretty, and he was also committed to another TV show. Roger Moore would be hired for a TV series called The Saint, which would air on October 4th, 1962, one day before the release of Dr. No. So how did the producers find their James Bond? Broccoli and Saltzman set up an informal contest and called it the Find James Bond Contest, and they had every amateur in show business apply. And after interviewing thousands of actors, the winner was a man named Peter Anthony. Anthony was a male model who looked the part. He was very handsome and very dashing, but unfortunately, he couldn't act. They tried acting classes, they tried tutoring, but he just couldn't play the role effectively. And then they came up with their runner-up, who was a man that impressed producers with his role in a Disney movie called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Broccoli and Saltzman really liked the rugged and macho look of Sean Connery, but they were worried that he would be unable to portray the aristocratic aspects of James Bond, because Sean Connery was not an educated man. He was a blue-collar truck driver, and when Ian Fleming had heard that this man had been cast, he was very upset. After all, Fleming had written James Bond to be an aristocrat and military officer like himself, and Fleming was not convinced that this blue-collar truck driver would be able to pull off the role of a gentleman spy. Director Terrence Young decided to make Sean Connery his personal project. Terrence Young introduced Sean Connery to his tailor, got him fitted in these expensive suits, actually had Sean Connery sleep in his suit to get more comfortable with the feel of it. And for months, Young took Sean Connery around town and hobnobbed with the elite aristocrats of England. The two went to expensive restaurants, casinos, and partied with a lot of the high-class wealthy women of London. And to Sean Connery's brilliance, he picked it up. He picked up the subtle mannerisms and the nuances of London aristocrat culture. James Bond historians credit Terrence Young as adding the suave and aristocratic manner of Bond to Connery's already masculine and rugged demeanor. It was the synergy of Connery and Terrence Young that created the perfect storm of what we now think of as the complex duality of James Bond. Now, contrary to popular belief, Sean Connery did not wear a toupee in this film, nor in From Russia with Love. Apparently, he still had a full head of hair. Although the balding process had begun, he did not officially start losing hair until Goldfinger, and it was in the third film where Connery began to wear a hairpiece. In terms of the story, when Terence Young read the script, he was a little concerned about whether James Bond could work or not. Young felt that if James Bond were to be played completely straight, the character would be too despicable and too offensive for the mass audiences. Terence Young felt that the film needed a little bit of humor. Make it a little campy, so if Connery were to play the character in a tongue-in-cheek manner, it would help get past the censors, but would also be fun enough to appeal to a mass audience. Terence Young also felt that there were too many flaws in the story of Dr. No. So he had this idea that he could just make up for the flaws in storytelling by keeping the action fast and making it a visual roller coaster ride. The audiences would be having too much fun to notice the flaws in the story. And this is the way editor Peter Hunt also edited the story, to be very kinetic and dynamic and very fast-paced. For the role of the main villain, Dr. No, Ian Fleming had hoped his good friend and playwright, novelist Noel Coward, would play the part. Ian Fleming even sent a telegram to Noel Coward on behalf of Ian. However, Noel Coward emphatically rejected the role, and they received a telegram saying, "No, no, no." One of the actors Ian considered for Dr. No was Max von Sydow. However, Sydow turned down the role, but years later, Max von Sydow would go on to play the head villain Blofeld in the 1984 film Never Say Never Again. Fleming wanted to suggest his step-cousin Christopher Lee, who was already a prominent movie star. However, by the time Fleming pitched Christopher Lee to Eon, producers had already hired Joseph Wiseman for the role. Christopher Lee would go on to play a James Bond villain years later as Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun. Joseph Wiseman, who is Caucasian, wore makeup and prosthetics to appear more Asian. And Wiseman played Dr. No in a very cold and calculating manner where he has this unnerving calm at all times. This actually contrasted to the way Joseph Wiseman was in real life, who was extremely nervous on set, but once the cameras rolled, he transformed into this very cool character. Lois Maxwell was a character actress in England, and her husband had just suffered a heart attack and they needed money. So she called her friends and asked for a role in this upcoming movie. Director Terence Young felt that she didn't have the star quality for a major role and offered her a bit part. He let her choose between the secretary Miss Moneypenny or Bond's girlfriend Sylvia Trench. Lois Maxwell learned that Sylvia Trench would be in a scene dressed only in James Bond's shirt and worried that the scene would be too revealing, and so she chose the role of Miss Moneypenny and even wore her own clothes for the scene. She would go on to play that part for 14 films. The role of Sylvia Trench went to Eunice Gayson, who was actually going to originally play Moneypenny but switched roles with Lois Maxwell. Sylvia Trench was supposed to be a recurring role in the James Bond franchise, but that idea ended up being dropped. Eunice Gayson is now regarded as officially the first Bond girl in the history of cinema. Bernard Lee was hired as James Bond's boss M. Peter Burton was hired as a quartermaster, Major Boothroyd. And Zena Marshall was hired as the Chinese Spectre agent, Miss Taro, and she would have to wear makeup to appear more Asian. She'll go on to be the second Bond girl in cinema history and the first official bad Bond girl. Jack Lord played James Bond's CIA counterpart, Felix Leiter, and despite a lackluster performance here, he'll go on to a phenomenally successful TV career in Hawaii Five-0. And finally, for the role of the main Bond girl, Honey Ryder, they had trouble filling this role. And even as late as 2 weeks into production, they still had not cast Honey Ryder. Harry Saltzman saw a photograph of an unknown model named Ursula Andress, and they contacted Ursula Andress and offered her the part without an audition nor reading. However, during filming, they were concerned that Ursula Andress' skin was too white and did not appear like someone who grew up in the sun-drenched locale of Jamaica. So every morning before filming, she had orangish-brown makeup applied to her body to appear more tanned. Ian Fleming may not have been a fan of Sean Connery's casting, but he absolutely fell in love with Ursula Andress and thought she was wonderful casting for the role of Honey Ryder. He was so struck by Ursula Andress that he actually mentions her in his next book on Her Majesty's Secret Service. However, Ian felt that her thick German accent was not right for the part and dubbed her voice with Nikki van der Zyl, who was also German but had much less of an accent. She also gives the character a sexually charged but very innocent voice to the character of Honey Ryder.
What are you doing here? Looking for shells?
Nikki van der Zyl would also go on to be the voice of Jill Masterson in Goldfinger, the voice of Domino in Thunderball, the voice of Kissy Suzuki in You Only Live Twice, as well as numerous other voices in the various James Bond films. Ursula Andress would define beauty in the 1960s. The moment she comes out of the water is regarded as one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. Another important cast member for Dr. No are the incredible sets used in the film, especially Dr. No's underground lair, which is a character unto itself. And this was designed by Ken Adams, who will also become a James Bond franchise staple. In Dr. No's underground lair, Bond notices a painting and does a double take. And we all missed the reference here, but audiences in the theaters in 1962 would have gotten the reference. This painting is the Portrait of Duke Wellington by Francisco Goya, and this is a real portrait that had been stolen in 1961 and was a huge mystery that was prominent as front page news at the time. And police assumed some mastermind criminal had stolen it, and the joke here is that the mastermind was Dr. No. Ken Adams himself painted the replica we see on film, and everyone in 1962 would have gotten the joke. Incidentally, it turned out that a bus driver had stolen it, and he voluntarily returned the painting unharmed in 1965, 4 years later, and ended up serving 4 months in prison for the crime. Eon Productions reached out to musician Monty Norman after Cubby Broccoli became a fan of his theater production of Belle. Monty Norman was a hot up-and-coming musician in the London theater scene. Monty Norman initially declined the offer, but Harry Saltzman offered Norman and his family a paid trip to Jamaica, and this excited Norman. He was able to have a paid family vacation to an exotic locale for free. And once in Jamaica, he had a great time and he agreed to write the score. Monty Norman wrote several songs for Dr. No, most of which ended up not being used in the final cut of the film. But Monty Norman will later contribute something much greater to the James Bond franchise, but we'll talk about that in a few moments. We also have to talk about the tarantula scene, which may have been terrifying at the time. In the book, it is not a spider, but a poisonous centipede. And apparently the production staff were utterly terrified of this tarantula. They even used a stuntman and a plate of glass to separate Sean Connery from the spider. At that time, most people didn't know much about tarantulas. And today we have people raising pet tarantulas, and we know that they're very friendly and very safe. They're not poisonous and make very friendly pets. So now when you watch the scene, you see James Bond just in panic, truly shaken, and he's smashing this poor beast with a shoe in panic. It is almost laughable to see today. There's an interesting scene in the movie where James Bond has a drop on Professor Dent, a geologist who is secretly a Spectre agent. And this scene would be very controversial because there was a debate whether our hero would shoot a defenseless man. In the end, Eon decided to go for it and filmed the most controversial take of the scene, where Bond mercilessly assassinates the unarmed Professor Dent in cold blood. And it is a cold-blooded scene where James Bond coolly and without any emotion nor remorse shoots and kills Dent. And it is here, in this very moment, in this very scene, where cinema saw the complete birth of the James Bond character on film. A devilishly handsome, witty, sophisticated, intelligent hero with immense sex appeal and a hard right hook, who is also a dark, brutal, remorseless, cold-blooded killer. But all in the service of his country. For the opening of the movie, they wanted to do something special, a symbol of the 007 character, a logo of sorts. The idea came from Maurice Binder. Maurice Binder designed the iconic gun barrel sequence, and he accomplished it by simply pointing a small camera through an actual gun barrel of a real gun. The actor in the sequence is not Sean Connery, but his stuntman Bob Simmons. Sean Connery would not be in the gun barrel sequence until the fourth film, Thunderball. While editing the film, Terrence Young and editor Peter Hunt wanted a new piece of music which could punch up the movie. They contacted Monty Norman, who had composed much of the soundtrack for the film, most of which would be unused, and it is here, after his primary work was already done, during the editing of the movie, where Monty Norman would give his greatest contribution to the James Bond franchise. Monty Norman had already written a song called Bad Sign, Good Sign for his own theater adaptation, V.S. Naipaul's novel, A House for Mr. Beeswax.
I was born with this unlucky sneeze.
And the score had a very Indian sound, but Norman decided to split the notes, and when he did, he realized he had just written the score for James Bond. And Eon took Monty Norman's new score and hired musician John Barry to compose an entire jazz arrangement around Monty Norman's theme. When Monty Norman heard the James Bond theme and what John Barry did with his short medley, he was so impressed and completely blown away. He loved it. The James Bond theme will be used at the opening of the movie, at the introduction of the character, with James Bond at the casino playing baccarat, or rather, chemin de fer, and it is here, with his cigarette dangling coolly off his lips, he says the famous line,
Bond. James Bond.
And history was instantly made. That scene is regarded as one of the most memorable scenes in all of cinema. And the score, named the James Bond theme, was heard all throughout Dr. No and would eventually come to define the James Bond franchise. After completion of the movie, everyone had a great time. They all said goodbye, assuming that this was it. After all, to most of the cast and crew, they had just made a nice B movie. But to their shock, Dr. No was an international box office hit. How did this film do? This film was a huge hit in 1962. Made on a budget of only $1 million, it made $6 million in only a few short weeks. However, it would go on to make a staggering $60 million worldwide. And most films are happy to double its production budget or even make 4 or 5 times that. It is that rare uber successful film that makes 10 times its own budget. Dr. No made over 60 times its production budget, making it one of the most profitable films in cinema history. And this would guarantee the production of an immediate sequel that would go into production right away, the second film, From Russia with Love.